Our first speaker is Regina Meredith. Regina has spent over 30 years in the mainstream media as an NBC sports broadcaster with Brian Gumbel, a local news anchor, an environmental documentary filmmaker, and host of a national PBS vegetarian cooking show. Regina realized that the public would never get the full truth about the information they really need to know, and knows firsthand how the information is censored, edited, and disfigured so it complies with some sort of grand plan. In 2004, she and her husband, Scott Meredith, founded Conscious Media Network, an online media portal dedicated to sharing cutting-edge spiritual and scientific information with an international online community. Without further ado, I'd like to introduce our first speaker, Regina Meredith.
I think I have to wait a moment before I can say hi. I'm going to assume we're all good here. The live streaming adds another element to it, and you can tell from the intro, I'm a restless person. I have to keep it moving forward. Thus, the show Open Minds, because it's kind of a basket for anything I find new and exciting. My background has spanned all these different topics just because I loved it at the time. But running behind all of that was always a passion for trying to understand the deeper truth of all of these topics we're going to speak of today. That's why we created Conscious Media Network. But also, really, passion beyond that for me was trying to understand something even more complex, and that is, what is it to be a human being? So we're all here. You're going to see many, many wonderful talks. I've interviewed a lot of the people over the years and had the pleasure of having dinner with Sisto Paz last night and hearing his rendition of the origins of our species. And it was really fascinating to me, and you're, I think, going to be hearing more about that when he presents. And I think this is the question. We, as a species, for a variety of reasons, and I'll get into that a little bit later in the presentation, always bow to outside forces. We always seem to feel that we're somehow less than, and I would argue that that has almost been a built-in program from the beginning, and it's not appropriate any longer. It wasn't appropriate then, it's not appropriate any longer. At the same time, we have these other species that have, I think it's their birthright as well, so to speak, to come, to visit, to be. You can say that we're extensions of that to a degree. Many call us a hybrid species. I'm going to get into a story that I hold very, very dear about the origins of the human species that really would indicate we can't really continue making these dividing lines between other beings from other places, other galaxies, even interdimensionally, and the human being. But what I would say is, this is our planet. We are the species that is here. This is our play yard. This is for us to learn, to grow, and this is for us to display our magnificence. The other species that come here are not visiting us just to tinker. We're an incredibly fascinating species in and of ourselves, the human being. And so, while it may add a certain amount of, you could say entertainment, you could say enlightenment, or you could say confusion to the story of what we are, I want to just do a really quick backstory. And I'm starting with this to move forward into the implications, which is laying a groundwork, I think, for a lot of the other talks that will be happening here, because you're going to hear different renditions of this from everybody, whether it's from a religion that you may have been steeped in your background or even currently, or whether it's the ufology and the stories that it's brought forward from other types of ET species and their rendition of what we are. there are a few basic tenets that I really want to bring forward. And we're going to start with one. Anything and anyone that states they are above or more powerful than us here in our domain is not. That is my dividing line between the refinement, and I like the word refinement, refined consciousness, you can say it, of any species. It's the same as you would say of any good parent, of any good teacher. When you have someone that is still in the evolving stage, the first thing is you honor them for exactly what they are, and you uplift and encourage them. Now, while we may still be in a state of our own personal evolution, revolution, advancement, where we could use some interesting guiding influences, we're not to be dominated or be held as less than any other species within this universe. And that I'm adamant about. And I would even like to say that because of the nature of what we are, we really uphold a possibility very few species will ever be able to lay claim to. And that is the ability to be in the flesh and to be able to overcome this density and all that it brings, which it brings with us a density of emotions, for one. It also, because of the story I'm going to tell you in a moment, in my opinion, brings forth the opportunity for us to be controlled and exploited as well. And we've all heard of some of these stories. We've heard of beings from, that roam around the galaxies, and they're here to exploit and control, use resources and so forth. To me, that's part of the story. It's not a dominant part of the story. And to me, it's a part of the story that's actually getting really old. So with that, I'd like to just launch into a new rendition of the origin story. And that some of you who have heard me, I think 3 years ago, I shared this with you. The rest of you probably have not heard this story nor a story like it. And I just want to say, just to set it up, it's all stories. Everything you're going to hear here this weekend is basically a story. However, some stories, such as what you saw evidence to a bit ago, the Rendlesham Forest affair, Jim Pendleton, and others, they have documented the chronology of certain stories that they had multiple eyewitnesses to, and even more so, what I love about Rendlesham Forest affair and that particular incident is that you also get to see the chronicling of a cover-up. More than the story is the chronicling of the cover-up. It's not just the wonderful symbols he was able to pull down, but how our own people on this planet go about keeping us from information that is our birthright. And that is our history, the history of the others that have been here with us all along, and how we all weave this story together so that it works for us. Finally works for us. So, I mean, you do have these collaborative affairs where you have multiple witnesses, you have a direct cover-up that can be essentially documented from person to person, date to date. But when it comes to the story of our ancient origins, that's a little bit different. There is no documentation. If you go with the Hindu renderings of it, which is a timeline I feel comfortable with, which is not just billions but trillions of years old, in terms of the formation of this solar system, our planet, and this species, then you're looking at a very simple story that they bring forth. There's even a little YouTube video on it with the great creator Vishnu having a vision, having a lotus blossom emerge from his belly button, and having all of creation then manifest. This isn't a lot different than what you'll see in any of the religious teachings. And most of them are cosmically oriented, and they're metaphorical. They were never meant to be taken literally. Even down to the one that probably for most of you would be most familiar with, which is the Judeo-Christian teachings, and starting at the very beginning, the confusion and cloud of the stories as what we are and how we got here. You can even start with Genesis 1 and 2, and I just wrote a couple of little contrasting notes between the two. Genesis 1, 6 times people, the creation, people are referred to as good. The earth is referred to as good, but 6 times people are good. Humans are created in the image of God, and I know that's loaded. We all have perceptions of what that means. Male and female created this reality equally because everything is in balance throughout the universe. Polarity exists so that we have this experience in between. Creation was done by a we. Okay, Genesis 2, okay? The portrayal of humanity is that we are disobedient. We're somehow some fallen lesser species. Humans were more of a curse than a blessing. Males created first. Male was created first. Later, the inferior version, the female, and that finally creation was done by a male. Which, think about it, what in this world exists without the polarity of male and female? Yet, in Sunday school, that's what I was taught. I was taught the crueler Genesis 2 version of what we are. And as a result of it, on a personal level, I rejected all of it. And of course, we go through our throwing the baby out with the bathwater for these very reasons. When we're touched up against something that really makes absolutely no sense to us and sounds cruel in its inception, then why would we buy into that as a basis for how we're going to gain our morality and ethics in life? So that's just the Bible alone, the Judeo-Christian faith, two highly conflicted books right up at the front. So many years ago, about 30 years ago, I came in contact with a woman, and this wouldn't be much different from the Findhorn group or the Urantia group. There was a blossoming of mystics, channelers, and so forth, particularly in the early 1980s. There were really early in the history of Europe and America, Russia as well, in the teens, 20s, and 30s. Lots of mystics coming forth with a lot of really refined knowledge, remembrances. In this one, this happened to be the wave of people. I think there was J.Z. Knight, Ramtha, that wave in the early 1980s. There was a woman who is not known. No one would know her name. I happened to bump into her through a series of events and asked her for, at the time, what I didn't know what it was, but it was a channeling. It's the first time I'd heard that word. As I got to know the woman, she said, well, we've written this little book. She was quite modest. She didn't like doing channeling, which is why nobody knows her. And then it started becoming clear this was much more than a coincidence. This is a very deep soul resonance, not just between the woman and myself, but between the beings, the woman and myself. And ultimately, there were a few other people that made their way there that had this same resonance, where we were once and are all a part of a same collective of souls, you could say, just like we're all part of a collective of souls. She had written this horrible little book that was just very poorly written, very poorly edited, and what it was just kind of randomly snatched pieces of channelings that had happened through her by random people that had come through. But if you were patient enough to read it, it had some of the most profound information that I've read yet to this day. And as you know, I've read thousands and thousands of books and, interviewed probably a couple thousand people in depth by now. It's just what I do. And so I'm always reflecting and comparing information, looking for a larger emerging story. That's my passion. Where do the connecting points come? Where can we see kind of common roots and common truth? That said, this story is unique and different, but what I immediately found in it is these pieces were rising up in this poorly written book. So I had the opportunity to speak with that same being pretty much whenever I wished. They were very generous in allowing me to do that, to start stitching pieces of history together as rendered by these beings. And they do not they're not interested in identity. They're interested in the sovereignty of us, our choices, our decisions, our experience, our minds. And so there's no reason to give you kind of an identity beyond the quality of the information and how that information feels in your uniquely designed matrix of intuition, feeling, intellect, which is also unique to the human species in this way. These beings then filled gaps or details in the story for me that weren't there previously. As I continued my research in all these other areas with all these other wonderful people, I started realizing each story is just a tile in a mosaic. And all of this can fit beautifully together. There is nothing, even though you'll hear stories this weekend that seem like they almost might conflict with each other, they're not. They're coming through that specific filter and lens of the individual that saw, heard, or brought that information through on any level, intuitive or intellectually. So everything is filtered through that. And the entity or beings that they've been in contact with are filtering it in through their perception of us. So we don't have anything at all to rely on for an essential truth. And this is about truth. It's about truth rising again, except our own inherent sense of truth, which comes through our own filters, our own subconscious. So I ask that when you listen to what I have to say, or when you listen to what anyone has to say, there's no right and no wrong here. It's about taking the collective in, feeling it in you like a tuning fork for truth that you are, and selecting what makes sense in your world, what makes sense to a higher dynamic, what takes you more deeply into higher frequencies of love, compassion, and acceptance for one another. That's all there is. That's really the game of being human. That's where we have a chance to lift ourselves to levels that other beings really can't even comprehend, because it's not easy to do that here. With that said, the story begins. And I won't say they said, he said, she said. I'm just going to tell you the story. In the beginning, and the beginning was simply, we're only using this tiny example, which is of Earth, which is of the creation of Earth itself, within our solar system, within the cosmos, within the universes, multiverse, as it were, multidimensionally, because we can't untie the dimensions from one another. Michikaku, many other people have stated this ages ago. It's not even up for debate any longer. We live in a multidimensional reality. The beings that you'll be hearing about and hear reference to and see drawings of, some of them can show themselves in one dimension one way and may look different in another dimension, for example. So here you have this particular creation, which they said nothing happens without some intelligence behind it. There has to be a thought, a design, just as the simple analogy of Vishnu and the lotus from his tummy button, creating all things. That is how it is. We have creators. We have beings that create on magnificent levels, just like many of us create magnificent works of art or any kind of work we do in our life. That is our creative process. They simply can create at a larger scale. So they said there were beings that created this particular solar system, as it's always done that way, with its particular desired features, for maybe a particular reason, to create an environment that can sustain a particular kind of exploration or life. This one was created in a particularly diverse fashion. And they said what creates a human being was nothing more than an anomaly in the beginning. And that anomaly was that there is, so to speak, a veil between dimensions. Some of you, like Andrea Perron and others, many others in this room, can see beyond the veil into other dimensions of beings. Normally, we don't do that. They're not aware of us, we're not aware of them, and that's for purpose. There's absolutely no functional good in being able to see all the dimensions that are interfacing with you at this very moment. You wouldn't have a defined reality of any kind. You'd just be diffused and distracted into everything that is around you. There's no point in it. If those of you who've taken the mystical path have chosen to gain the skills to peer into another dimension, well, that's by will and choice, and it's for purpose, but that's not what I'm talking about. In this case, generally speaking, you have a dimensional density that is visible to those within that density. Right, just slightly phased off, you have another one. Those beings are living within that, and on and on. You can literally hold out your hand, and there may be a universe the size of atomic beings, intelligent beings, in your palm. That's how incredibly diverse and rich the field is, the soup that we live in. As the earth, the physical earth that we know as our earth, was being formed, there was a dimensional rift or plasticity between it and another dimension in the same place, more or less. So you could say another dimension of earth. In this field were beings that already existed and lived, just as there are throughout the cosmos in every dimension, every kind of being. If you were to look at them, they would appear to be almost like an electrical shimmer, But these were beings of very high degrees of intelligence and creativity, extraordinarily high abilities to create because of the lack of density in that dimensional field, create at the speed of thought. And as much as that sounds absolutely delightful to us because things are so darn slow, it's like moving through mud to create on this planet a lot of times, there was a curiosity as to what was happening in this more dense area. The anomaly is that they could actually not only see into what was happening over a very, very long period of time. An Earth like this, a planet, does not come together quickly. It's a process of thought, of rotation, spin, elements, gases, things forming to create a physical reality. As Tom Campbell, my big toe, would say, a collectively rendered reality. The beings of this higher frequency range, and when I say higher, I don't mean better, just less dense, with these capabilities, had the ability to peer into the creation of this planet. They were intrigued with the diversity of life forms, whether they be plant or animal. And at this time, the life forms were still relatively simple. And there is a place for evolution, absolutely in this, where something is given seed to, adapts to its environment, and then continues refining itself through its own development. There is that, but very specific templates had already been laid down. And this was fascinating to these beings. They were able to actually move through from where they are into this field when it was still at a much higher rate of spin. This was at a higher rate of density originally, lighter. Okay, as this was happening, it takes time for something to cool down, so to speak, into its lower density form. So this would have been a little easier for a higher being to look into because it was still at a higher frequency than where we are now. So it might have been mildly phased off from where they naturally lived, where now it might be, and it would be quite difficult for the same beings to be able to transit back and forth. In fact, some would say almost impossible. So they began coming over and experimenting. Now, this is where Edgar Cayce's work comes in. There were these, gleeful, highly intelligent, wonderful beings that came into this place and started playing with, as he would say. And these beings would say the same thing, experimenting and playing with the denser life forms that were here simply because they could. So if you would imagine being able to just put yourself into a tree or a bird or into the water and maybe project yourself into a fish just to see what it feels like. That is what they were doing. There was not any malevolent kind of agenda in this at all. It was simply experimenting and feeling density, feeling a body of some kind because they could. They didn't have this. And this is really critical for a lot of beings that come and go, especially interdimensionals. They don't have this. They can't perceive in the way we can perceive. As the beings continued doing this, they began, and this is where some of the stories that intersect with it can sound malevolent, but actually were not. And that is, they began tinkering with the electrical system. And that is to make it a little easier, more possible to be able to merge with that life form. At the same time, the life forms, the beings, the bodies of the animals were becoming more complex. This is more interesting to experiment with. And I can say this ability continued in through the Lemurian times. Lest we think they're terrible, I can tell you one experience. I was taken into many, many regressions by the husband of the woman who brought this information through. He was an old Atlantean hypnotist, I guess, mystic. And he took me back, and I would go to many different epochs of history. And I'm only telling you this one brief one for purpose. One of the things is a time I went to when I appeared to be a young male, probably what would look like a teenage male. I went to this place, and it was reedy and sandy. There was no ability to see color yet. Everything was in sepia tones. The only color at all in there was a slight hint of a purplish, where red might have infused with brown a little bit, into these very large birds, prehistoric birds that existed at the time, larger than condors. What we used to do, because we could, I could, whoever could do what I could did, and other people were doing it as well. We would make agreement, telepathic agreement with the animal, and we would simply, you know, do a little nod for a joyride. And we would get out of our body, project ourselves into theirs, and we would go for a little joyride. And you can see when other people were doing this as well. It wasn't just one person. And because these birds were very efficient, they only flew for prey. They did not fly for kicks, just to joyride, so to speak, enjoy the air under their wings. They didn't do that. They were big, they were weighty. But I used to do that, and I recall everything about it. I recall everything that I felt in my feathers and my heart and my body, their body, as I occupied that being for a short moment of time to do a little cruise around, set back down, you know, namaste, thank you for letting me use your body for a little bit. And I thought, of course, when I came out of this, I thought, this is fantastical. And I'm not a person prone toward really kind of, I'm creative, artistic, but not wild imagination. So I thought I'd made it up. When I came back, I said, I don't think it means anything. He'd recorded it. And he said, oh? And he went and ruffled through a box, and he played a tape where another woman was having a regression, and she did exactly the same thing. And there were others as well. So, lest we judge those beings for trying to inhabit a body that wasn't theirs, it was just for the pleasure of it, for the experience of it. But what happened over time when they started now tinkering with the electrical system, just tweak it a little bit, so it's a little easier to inhabit, maybe for a little bit longer, problems did begin. And that is where some distortion in DNA started occurring. And it was understood pretty quickly, this is not acceptable, it's not going to be allowed any further, just on a larger scale. And we agreed, this is true. Although there's probably always a rogue being or two, there always are, but by and large it was agreed, this is not good. At the same time, this experiment, this creation, it wasn't an experiment, this earth was beginning to slow down and to consolidate in its physical reality and complexity of life forms. Again, over a very long period of time, these beings knew this time was coming. Everybody was made aware. You can only do this so long before there's such a disparity in your vibrational frequencies that you can't go between these two places anymore. You just won't be able to do it anymore. And so there were those who decided, that's okay, I'm committed to this, I'm staying. They had a choice to go. There were those who chose to stay. The vast majority of them had simply overstayed their time, and their frequencies had become, you could say damaged, but certainly altered or lowered after being in this physical reality long enough. They couldn't make that transition back anymore. If any of you go into and out of very deep meditation or do astral travel or project yourself, you'll know what I'm talking about. It can happen within a range, and when you come back into this body, it's like coming back into stone. It's so dense compared to where you've been. Well, we'll take that by a factor of much more, many factors more. That's what these beings were dealing with. So now there was an issue. They'd overstayed. They're living in a physical reality with no means of expression. They're not allowed to interfere anymore with the native beings that are here. And so this is where the ET story starts intersecting with it. This was being watched throughout the cosmos by many different planetary beings, advanced species, those who could actually come here technologically, and interdimensional beings. It was a source of fascination. When the time came, the decision was made, there had to be a body that these beings could incorporate with if it was the will and agreement of that species. Now, when you look at the different species of various developments of up to the human, those were separate. Those weren't evolutions of each other per se. And you know this from Graham Hancock's work and others now. These were not just knocked on evolutions of one before. There were many different iterations of what it was to become a hominid. And so there was at that time one that was, I asked about this once. I said, well, what was the original species like, the original human animal like? And they said, very much like you are now. Not a big difference at all. They were not, they said you could say they were, in our terms, a distant cousin of an ape, but much more refined already higher intellect, already great capabilities, but not the kind of intellect, certainly not the kind of creativity or any of that we have now, because they were living in a survival-based, short lifespan-based reality for the most part. There was an agreement between the species. The animal species would have an even higher intellect, higher capabilities. There would be pictures were relayed. It was translated through ET species that came to assist in the process to communicate between the two, because they had the non-physical beings, which they called the portals simply because they came through this plasticity zone or portal. The portal beings had no means of really communicating with the animal, and the animal, nor did the animal with them. But there were certain ET species that could translate, third-dimensional ETs, who could translate between the two telepathically. An agreement was made that we would now have a merging of the two. And this is the story of humanity according to these highly integrous beings. I've dealt with them for many years, and I haven't seen them wrong on anything yet. I can say that personally, but that's the story of being human. When the time of merging came, there was electrical engineering done. There was work done on our brainstem. All of these things were done at the hand of ET species who came in to help the merging process. This was a magnanimous thing on everybody's part. It was a desperate thing more on the part of the portal beings. They were cut off. They didn't have a choice. They had to do something. The animal saw what was in it for them. The human saw what was in it for them. And the others simply came to help because they had the capability to do so. So after some, you might say, a little electrical engineering, tweaking on the nervous system, brainstem, and so forth, had been accomplished, there was a time where the actual merging would occur. And that is the source of our lack of memory, our trauma, and everything that is human, what it is to be a human being. The merging was, if not a complete unmitigated disaster, it was extraordinarily challenging, with only a small percentage actually coming through the other side of it, having their memory, their creativity, and their capabilities while in this human body form. Instead, what happened is, and the being said, everyone watching saw what was going on. It was now considered an experiment. It wasn't intended, but it was an experiment at this point. That as they watched this, they had no idea how this merging would turn out. There was no way to gauge because it's not done. It's irrational and chaotic, and that's not how the universe works. That's not how species continue to refine themselves as a single source species. A lot of species have a little bit of genetic engineering. That's one thing, but the implications of this are massive. This animal had its own soul. Now, granted, its life may have been more simple. Its life may have been more ordered toward simple community and its own survival. But it had its own soul. It had its own intellect. It had its own conscious mind. It had its own subconscious mind already. It had been here living for quite a while at this point. Meanwhile, the portal being coming through with its infinite ability to create, absolutely no understanding of physicality nor mortality. These are immortal beings. They don't have anything physical going. You live until you dissolve, I guess. These beings coming through with this desire to touch and feel life in a new way through the senses, it didn't work that way. As they explained it, the animal, when this happened, was terrified because this massive amount of electricity, imagine, getting struck by lightning, a massive amount of electricity coming into the body. Its heart was pounding and everything was coursing, and its body was freaking out. The body was going into a type of trauma. The being, for the first time, was actually encased in flesh and senses. They said one of the most challenging parts of it was that the light pouring in through the eyes made them almost instantly mad, insane. The sounds through the ears, The smells, which probably were pretty unpleasant during this process, I would guess, were absolutely overwhelming to the being. So as they started settling into this uneasy merging, there was nothing really at this point that could be done. You're talking about merging with an adult animal. Over time, there were others who came in to try to help guide them, try to help them, as the presence of that intelligence of the portal being was there, into understanding some simple things that was overwhelming the senses of the animal at this time. Basics, mating, community, all of these very simple things that these beings were not prepared for, had no real understanding of, all had to be integrated within this kind of finer, higher frequency range. And at the same time, the animal is still concerned for its own survival. It has so many years. It's afraid of its surroundings. It's afraid of being, of course, hunted and extinguished. Any life form will fight for its own life, and they were no exception. We're no exception. And so at the end of this process, ultimately, the conscious mind of the animal, which is driven towards survival and is very based in innate, reasonable fear, became the dominant mind. The experiment was almost over before it began, except for a few in the beginning. I don't think I need to explain to anyone, we're the only species on this planet that can just burst into tears at an act of kindness, generosity, beauty, bravery. It strikes us so deeply. There's a reason for that. That is our being part. However, that being doesn't exist anymore. We're not that shimmering, highly creative, highly intelligent being that can create at the speed of thought all by itself. We are merged with a survival-based animal body. Yet, at the same time, the time has come, and it's come at other times in the past. Part of the Atlantean period was the adjustment period, but there were a good percentage of beings that were in physical form, that were able to open the gates of perception beyond survival back up into their true abilities, which many of the people in this room can now do. The Earth's frequencies have become more refined over time. We've all heard about these shifts. You can't be on the Earth if you can't match its frequencies. And as much as we complain and seem like the world has gone to hell in a handbasket and these atrocious acts of violence occurring around us, the fact is, arguably since maybe very early Atlantean times, we've probably never been more refined. We've never been more willing to come to the help of each other. I mean, just a short couple hundred years ago, people would go to hangings as entertainment with dull eyes, just looking for a little blood, you know. We're way further along than that in a very short period of time. So the period is here now. The invitation, I even believe that that is part of why the ET presence is so strong now. Just a sec, I have a little cough. Cough too. I think that we're at this time now where the Earth's frequencies have refined themselves enough, where we as a species have begun refining ourselves enough. So many people going into the study of mysteries of one kind or another, contemplation, meditation, that you have twofold thing happening here with other species, with other ET cultures coming here. One is they see we're on the precipice and they're trying to whisper and remind us. And mind you, so are our guides 24/7. And just to finish that story off, some of the beings that came over the first time there were some that said, I can't do this again, but I can stay on in the guiding realm. And so many of our guides are the first original beings that know the experience of the merging because they did it once, and they're actually still here with us, guiding us from between our true selves and what we're doing now. Sorry. By the way, when I do Gaia interviews, I have to do this every now and then in an interview. They just cut it out. Kind of this dry desert cough. I live in the desert. So there's the possibility now for each and every one of us to do this, to know, to remember. Meanwhile, as Sistos will tell you about, others will tell you about as well, part of the fascination with us is we have this kind of hybrid ability to feel, experience, and intuit in the world that other types of species don't have, not in the same way. We are able to run this higher aspect of ourselves down through a physical body. The things we call feelings are distinctly separate from emotions, and that's where we're gaining a tremendous amount of our knowledge in the world, our ability to navigate our everyday world. That some people align to the word intuition, but it's actually coming in through the body. You can feel it in your stomach. We've all heard of the studies of neuropeptides. They're getting it faster than our brains are. Technology is showing that. Same thing with our hearts through Heart Math Institute. Our hearts are getting the truth before our brains are getting it. This is the slowest unit to process anything. Meanwhile, and the least reliable because of the incredible amount of filters running through it. So you have here a twofer species, basically, a blended species with two different souls that had to find a way to work together, one dominating, the other receding, and trying to find our way back to balance, which is, why can't we be this incredibly expressive, sensuous species, and at the same time, these very refined beings? That's what it is to be a human being. That's why so many are here so fascinated with us, because the experiment is not over. And when I would speak to these beings that shared this knowledge and 30 more years of knowledge, it's been absolutely fascinating, they said they would call us not the soul, but the soul development. It wasn't until literally a couple years ago I said, why do you keep calling us the soul development? You're not calling species elsewhere soul developments. And they said, because you're a soul that's still under development. You're still learning to blend the higher frequency portal being, the one that can create at the speed of thought, with very advanced intelligence, with the sensual, physical animal being that initially knew its way around the world. It knew survival on this planet. Really, the higher frequency that came in with its intelligence suppressed the instinct of the animal to a very large extent. So we're almost less capable of dealing with our world because of that. So you have this soul development that is a great curiosity and fascination that you have the ability to play within. Let me just see what's going on here. I'm not really sure where I am on timing. Oh, there we go, good, because I want to leave time for Q&A. The most fascinating part being we have been hoodwinked into believing we're less than. If you go to Chris Hardy's book, I think it's called Wars of the Anunnaki, I did an interview with her. I don't know if it's come out yet because her English, not so good. She's French. But I found her book absolutely fascinating. She takes Sitchin's work deeper. And basically she's saying, no, look further into these statements. The Anunnaki, which we might even say passed down their tradition through the Sumerian culture, Mesopotamia, down into what became known as the Judeo-Christian traditions, set up housekeeping, Enlil in particular, as the God. He's the God. He's the one, and he created man. My guess is Genesis is heavily influenced by the presence of that particular species and individual. The interesting thing she caught in it is they would go to others, hybrids and others, for information, intuitive information. They didn't have those capabilities. They had very advanced technology, including nuclear weaponry, But they didn't know how to do these things that we can so clearly do, that we just call, I just had a feeling, and boom, there it is. You see the person 2 minutes later. This is an incredible skill that humans have, and it doesn't mean other species aren't telepathic, can't create, and don't have any intuition, but we have a unique way of discerning knowledge and our world through a physical body combined with this incredibly, I'd say, advanced in terms of its ability to understand being. We're really a magnificent species, and that's why this talk is bow to no one, honor everyone. I mean that very sincerely. We are not a beggar species that has to sit at the feet of gods and ETs to be told what to do. If we opened up the gates to our own perception, we know exactly what to do. We know how to interact with the earth. We know how to be with each other. What's happened is because of this corruption, when some more negative type ETs did come to exploit and take advantage of people who were asleep. That's a story we all know about. You know, you'll find that in the Anunnaki story, for example. And by the way, they thought they were giving that species an upgrade also. They'd already been upgraded. Those sleeping people had, quote, already been upgraded. So they got a new upgrade from the Anunnaki with a more superior physicality so they could apparently do some work for them. Okay. So you do have exploitive species, although they didn't see it that way any more than most people saw animal experimentation on this planet. We're no different. We're no exception. So those beings have come for their purpose. The others are here to help us continue remembering. It's only about one thing, remembering and then connecting. We're not here to be told what to do by anybody else, but we can be shown glimpses of what one future timeline can look like, or another future timeline can look like. It's up to us to create those timelines, by the way. So these are not absolute. If we continue a trajectory, a particular trajectory of being, a way of being that rapes, pillages, and exploits, so you're going to likely have these timelines more likely as a manifestation than these over here. And the ET species who are coming through to say, you have the most exquisite potential on this timeline over here if you can respect your host planet and each other and cooperate, lift your game up, stop judging one another. Those are beings worth listening to as you would a patient grandmother or guide. They're just helping you remember what you innately already know. And those beings, for me, they're always welcome. Whether they're interdimensional, whether they're third-dimensional ETs that are able to get here and take up some of the lovely presenters that you're going to be hearing from and share their knowledge. If they tell you something that's truthful and takes you to a more refined state in your own ability to assess and discern, then that's someone worth listening to. But the reality is it's already all right inside you. And so how do you determine that? Most people don't know how to determine that unless they're already intuitives. Some people were born that way with all the filters off. For the average person that is still just contemplating the necessity of this as a part of their daily life, it's really simple. In my opinion, it's very simple. We're walking past our own life that's trying to whisper and reveal itself to us all the time. We fall into functional, habitual roles for out of need, that's the animal part, where this little thing's always happening. Like, it can be something as simple as you're walking down the street in a neighborhood, and there's a little sign down on the ground that the elementary school is having a play this Saturday night, and they need people to volunteer to help build props and things. You know, you walk, oh, that's cute, I used to do that. And you keep walking, has a phone number there, or you say, God, I loved it when I used to do that. And you just, that's what I call a really innate spark of desire. Not a desire, I want a second hamburger or beer desire, but a spark of really innate, true desire that's coming as a whisper of the soul, of the higher mind through to you. So when you listen to those little sparks of desire and think, God, I used to love it when I was in plays. And you know what? It'd be great to be around kids again. Why not? You call the number and boom, maybe you meet someone there. It turns out you guys have someone else in common and something new is starting from that. It wasn't even about building the props for that play. And I don't know how many of you, did many of you see the movie or read the book, The Yes Man? Jim Carrey started it. Not very many. Okay. The book is worth it. It was written by someone in London. It's called The Yes Man. I mean, I could give you lists of books to read. This is just for kicks. What's so cute about it is this man was just kind of a depressing git. You know, he's only, I think, in his 30s. And he just said no to everything. He gotten to the point where his life was closing in on him. He was totally habitual. He wasn't even showing up for dinner parties when his friends would invite him. He was too lazy to engage in life. He gets on a bus in London, and this little man says, you know your problem? You don't say yes. So it kind of, he'd had a bad day. It just hit him. And he thought, yeah, you're, okay. I'm going to say yes to just kind of on, like a gesture. I'm saying yes to everything that comes my way today. The Jim Carrey movie kind of shows some of it. The book is really good. It's hysterical in terms of the incredible possibility that happens just by saying yes alone. His life, by the evening, he's in some UFO meeting in an attic somewhere in London. I mean, it's crazy. And it goes on and on and on, where he gets a bunch of money, then he gives it all away because someone asks him for it. And it exemplifies really what I'm trying to say. Life is this incredible dynamic as a human being who has the ability to eat an ice cream cone, to touch each other's skin, have sex, have a baby and feel their little soft skin. We get to experience this incredible pleasure, and we have at our disposal this incredible vast well of creativity and wisdom if we just choose to not walk by our own lives. These little moments of yes, these tiny sparks of desire speaking to us saying, I don't usually like that, but I think I'm going to go do that. And then something happens. And then when that thing happens, something else happens. And so in my own life, my friends often say, oh yeah, that's easy for you because you lead a charmed life. You just decide to do something and do it. It's not like that. It's that I do know the value of saying yes. And I've said yes to some pretty ridiculous things that have caused me some trouble, too. I mean, you know, you don't get off easy all the time on that, and maybe I didn't have the best discernment even. But it took me somewhere interesting, and I always learned. It's not about luck. It is about showing up and hearing that tiny little voice. And once you start listening to that, then it starts developing trust in its relationship with you. You're going to get more messages, more of those little divine sparks of interest, of desire in something. They just start showing up more because they know you're listening, and it's you that's speaking to you. Sometimes it's your guide. If you're really dense, your guide will come in and kind of pound you with something. That's what they're there for. Otherwise, your own higher mind is speaking to you all the time and inviting you in. Life is supposed to be beautiful, expansive, and generous. One of the areas that I've studied for many years, in addition to all this other stuff, is I've been a student of the Hermetic philosophy for many years. And I remember this one line in one lesson that just captured me. And they said that the angels bow in shame before a human being, a person who has dared walk this path and who has found their way to a state of grace, compassion, love, elevation. Because it's really hard to do here. It's easy over there. When you create at the speed of thought, there's no obstacle, there's no resistance to anything. Anybody can do that. Any great being can do that. And many of those great beings, by the way, have walked this path. And they have elevated themselves into that. And it starts with something as simple as kindness, the great virtues, just simple. Kindness, a little bit of courage, just drop the judgment about one another. In fact, these beings said if we did that one thing, if we just stopped judging one another, this planet would have such a rapid expansion in consciousness almost overnight, just to stop judging one another. And you can feel the truth of that in you. We know what it's like to judge someone, that icky, tight, petty feeling that happens. We all do it. We know how it is to praise someone we genuinely feel has something beautiful to offer the world. So we're talking simple themes in the end. Don't walk by your own life. Listen to the little sparks of desire, because they are going to lead you into a whole new life. Every person in the room, you start saying yes to things you normally start saying no to because you feel a spark, your life is going to be different, if not a day from now, certainly in the next month or year from now. And that is the higher part of us, the being and our own divine genius speaking through to us. And there is there's nothing in this cosmos to be humbled by as a human being. We're taking our part in our unique and challenging journey to show that it can be done to the rest of the cosmos. With that, I say, bow to no one, but absolutely honor everyone. And with that, if we have any questions, I'm leaving a few minutes open for that. Are there any questions? I can't see you, so you'd have to stand up or speak up.
I think what we're going to do is have them come and talk to you later.
That's fine. Are we on time?
Otherwise, we'll go over.
Okay.
And yeah, so.
So we're right there now. Never mind. Find me in the hallway if you have any questions. Thank you so much for your time and attention. Enjoy the conference.
Thank you so much, Regina. It was a real pleasure to have her. And what I like to do in between the break is bring on another fantastic woman.